right, guys, we have a very cool guest coming up next here in the Sacramento Horror Film Festival. This man is a digital artist and a model maker in some of our favorite films on our channel. Most notably, excited to talk to this guy about his work he's done in the Star Wars franchise. Let me welcome digital artist and model maker John Goodson. How you doing tonight, man?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. Well, it's the first question I really have for you, and I know it's like the most basic one you can ask, is how did you get into doing the digital art and model making? Because they're both two, like, especially when I think of Star Wars specifically, you know, the digital artistry and then the model making are two like super prominent parts of that film. How did you get into doing both of them?
Well, the model making I started doing when I was about 5. Another kid in the neighborhood took an airplane model and smashed it with a book and just blew it to pieces. And I'd never had a model kit, so I took all these pieces and reconstructed this thing, which was hideous. But for me, that was my first thing, you know. So I was hooked right then. And then the other thing that was going on was my dad was in the Air Force, and our next door neighbor was a fighter pilot. Well, he watched Star Trek. And so he got me watching Star Trek with him. And then somebody got me a copy of the Making of Star Trek book. So I understood at age 5 that this wasn't real. And I was absolutely fascinated by that part of it, by the process. And I remember also when I was even younger, Lost in Space was on, and there was an episode called The Derelict. I think I was 3. And in that episode, the Jupiter 2 flies in and lands inside this alien spacecraft. And we think there was a 4-foot model that was the primary model of the Jupiter 2, but there was also a 10-foot model, which I saw a couple of years ago, which is enormous. And we think that's the 10-footer that was used in that episode where it lands. Well, as a 3-year-old, I was absolutely transfixed by that thing, and I wanted to take the TV apart to take it out of it. So thankfully, I couldn't take the television apart. I wouldn't be here talking to you. But, you know, so I was really intrigued with this stuff right from the get-go. So that sparked my enthusiasm for it. And then when Star Wars came out, and there were the Art of Star Wars books, each one of the original 3 movies got a book that went with it. They had a little bit of information in the back about a number of the different artists, sort of their education and their background. And a lot of them were industrial design or architecture. So I went to NC State and got a degree in product design, which was as close as they had. And then I had a friend I went to high school with who got a job in the creature shop. And he was working on Inner Space. I came out to visit him. They were doing Inner Space, and they were doing Star Trek 4. And so Star Trek 4, he had worked on the whales, the animatronic whales. So I came out and I stayed on his couch for about 5 weeks, a guy named Tony Hudson. And he was my introduction to industrial light and magic. And through that 5-week period, I went on location with them to a hotel in San Mateo. And we shot for 3 days there in a pool at a school. They had a 14-foot pool. And we could shoot the whales. There was a little room downstairs with a window so that the coach could watch the swimmers. Well, we had a video village down there, and we were watching everything in that room. So we were looking out at Pete Romano and the other guys working with the whales out there. And it was really cool. But over that 5-week period, I got to meet Steve Golly, Charlie Bailey, Yizo Young, Lauren Peterson. And these were all guys that had worked on the original trilogy of films. And, you know, I was like, what? I want to come here and work. And I had written letters to ILM in the past, and they would write me back going, thank you. We have your letter on file. You don't need to write us anymore. You know, leave us alone. So in meeting with all those guys, there wasn't anything to do at that point. Oh, I met Larry Tan. And I moved out to California hoping to get a job there. And within the first week, got a call from Larry to come over and spend a week on Body Wars, which was a Disney ride that was a simulator ride. It was a lot like Star Tours, but you got miniaturized and sent to the human body. So got hired for a week and basically was there for almost 31 years. And that transitioned. I was in the model shop for about 15, 16 years of that, and then transitioned into computer graphics. And that was the latter half of it. So, you know, and the transition to digital was just kind of a survival thing because it became apparent computer graphics was eroding the practical work. So, you know, if you wanted to make a living, it's gonna be hard to do it in the model shop because computer graphics went from this half a dozen people when I first got there in '88 to I transitioned on episode 3. And I worked in the art department up at the ranch doing physical concept models, came back down to ILM and transitioned over to the digital work. And so, you know, we're sitting in a theater with, I don't know, several hundred people that were now the digital department. So it was apparent that was the direction. If you wanted to stay in the business, that's what you had to do. So.
Yeah, with doing that, it's kind of cool to see that you've really gotten to have a significant hand in both. When you mentioned episode 3, that was one of the things that, as a Star Wars fan, is you always recognize was the digital artistry and the effects of that trilogy with some of the standard stuff. But now you've gotten to build the model for the RazorCrest in the Mandalorian, so you've gotten to do that very cool practical side of things too.
And that's very strange to have started off doing practical models and shooting motion control to now I'm primarily doing practical models and we're shooting motion control.
Yeah.
To go back, and it was really interesting. I was saying the other day on something I was tested or something, I said, it's been 15 years since we shot a model on stage, but when we walked out there, it was like it was yesterday. I mean, it just muscle memory kicks in and you're doing the same stuff. And it's been fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I can't, and I said it on the documentary they put out, I can't believe, we always talked about this stuff. Let's do a practical model. And then we never would do it. So when they came to me talking about the RazorCrest, I'm like, sure, sounds great. Let me know. Yeah, well, whatever. Hang up the phone, and then we actually did it. I was really surprised.
Yeah, I mean, his ship too is so like instantly uniquely his ship. It's kind of like his own version of the Millennium Falcon.
Yeah.
When you to become a fan of that show, when you guys built that thing, did you get the vibe that it would be?
By the time I was involved with it, it was all designed. Ryan Church had done the design work in conjunction with Doug Chang, and Rene Garcia and Jay Machado had done all the digital work. So they had a digital model. So then Landis Fields took that model and cut it up into pieces that were manageable on the 3D printers that he had and started printing like a maniac. So he was printing this stuff, and I would call him, like, what have you got? And he goes, I got 3 pieces. I'd go over to his house at 11 o'clock at night, get those pieces from him that weren't cured, bring them back to my place, start doing the curing process on them. And it was like, as soon as he could print the stuff, I was getting it from him, and then the RazorCrest was only 2 feet long, but it was in about 50 pieces. So it was like putting a deck of cards together. I first got the parts. I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking at, so he had to make me a color coordinated chart that showed me all the pieces in different colors so I could see what went where. But then the complication with it was that it was 3D printed, so it was fairly delicate, but it also had build lines in it. And the problem with the build lines is we're putting aluminum tape over this thing and polishing it. Well, every one of those little build lines telegraphs on the aluminum tape because it's reflective. So it was sanding it and filling it and getting it cleaned up so that it was smooth, and then taking a mold off of it and then recasting it in epoxy fiberglass. So the one that we actually used for filming, you could throw it across the room. It was very resilient, whereas the 3D print was really delicate. And 3D prints, that's an evolving technology. You can print in metal. SpaceX and the Royal Air Force are printing aircraft and aerospace parts right off the printers and flying them. So that's metal stuff. But then in plastics, there are all kinds of different materials you can get. The material we used was really nice, but it was very delicate. It's weird because like a normal plastic, you could drill into it. If you try and drill this stuff, it just explodes. So yeah, there's a learning curve on working with that stuff too. So, basically used it as the pattern to generate the mold to make the epoxy fiberglass version that had the armature and everything. And the other thing about filming miniatures is they have to be sturdy enough to handle being on stage. They also have to be able to withstand the heat of the lights. And they also have to have multiple mount points and electrical hookups in them so that you can, and that's one of the things that's different about doing the practical stuff versus the digital. When you're doing Transformers or something like that, they're primarily digital models. So there's no concern about, you can shoot it however you want to. Shot design is unlimited. Whereas when you do a practical thing, you're going to have a rod coming out of it somewhere. It's got to be supported. So that will also dictate a lot of the shot design. So there are limitations of what you can do physically. And they really went to great lengths on RazorCrest to recreate the physical constraints of what they had on the original Star Wars. So there were limitations to how much movement they had, what lenses they used, all of that stuff. John Knoll built a motion control camera from scratch in his garage that used a digital SLR body, but it was modified so that it would take the original Nikon lenses that were used on Star Wars. So some of those lenses Dennis Muren had. So some of those original lenses were used again on RazorCrest. So pretty cool project, kind of pulling in the old and some of the new.
And you definitely get the sense from that series and just from like every, behind the scenes interview soundbite type thing from anybody involved in making it that they wanted it to be a vibe that was exactly like A New Hope is possible.
Yeah,
and it does come across like that, man. You can tell that there's a lot of love there from everybody involved with Mandalorian.
well, it definitely seems like they've captured the magic that made the original trilogy really, really special. So,
you also did digital art in two that I actually like a lot. And out of the films that have come out since Disney's purchase, they've definitely made a fair amount of noise. Rogue One was a film that I went in with managed expectations just because, in a sense, we'd gotten The Force Awakens, and that was like a huge build up, and Star Wars is back, and now here's the next one, and we know it's not the continuation of Force Awakens, but it fits into the story. Mm-hmm. And so you're expecting a cool Star Wars movie, but I was not expecting it to be like the instant, like just blockbuster, like best one out of the one since Disney did it. Like that movie is just perfect from start to finish, really.
Well, it's funny because that was John Knoll's baby. He came up with that idea and kind of fostered it through the process. And there are a lot of people involved in making that happen, obviously. But it was John's initial concept to get that rolling, you know. So that was pretty cool because I've known John as long as I've been at ILM, and we're like a month apart in age. So it's kind of it's fun having him as a friend, but it's also amazing to see stuff like that. I mean, he and his brother wrote Photoshop, you know, little stuff like that, you know.
That's pretty wild.
Oh, yeah.
But when you guys are doing digital art on those films, do they let you, I guess, check it out? I'm sure you have to, if they did, you'd have to sign like an agreement and stuff. But I guess when you're working on it, are you getting a sense in your mind like, hey, people are really gonna dig this, or people are gonna think like, this is kind of whatever?
Well, I mean, it's, you know, working on films, it's really interesting because it's hard to tell what the end product is going to be. Sometimes you get a vibe, you can tell something's not right. And then there are times when I've read scripts where I'm like, the script's fantastic, it's great, and it does not translate on screen. And, you know, that's one of those problems that we all have, I think, is that, you know, I think back to when people would sit around the radio before they had, you know, televisions and before movies were readily available. They sit around listening to the radio, listening to, say, Lone Ranger. Well, they're their own costume designer, art director, lighting, cinematographer. Everything is going on in that person's head. And that's one of those things with movies where it's like, you know, a lot of times movies get built up with these expectations. It's the greatest thing you've ever seen. You have something in your head that you can't quantify, but there's no way the movie can ever live up to the expectation that's been created. And that's one of those things I'm always aware of. When there's a lot of buzz about something, I'm like, I better see it sooner than later, because if I wait, I'm going to be disappointed. And so it's hard to gauge that when you're looking at it, because there have been times I've looked at stuff, I thought, oh, wow, that's amazing. And it doesn't go anywhere. And other times, you know, it's stunning sometimes what catches on and what doesn't. But you also do feel a responsibility to the fans. And a lot of us that are working on these are fans of the films. So you want to try and do stuff that, you know, that lives up to the expectation if you can do it, you know. But again, you're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit because you just can't tell until you get the finished product what you got.
The Solo franchise was met with so much controversy just coming off of the heels of The Last Jedi. You know, it takes the hit in the box office. By hit, I mean, it still does 83 some odd million opening weekend, which is pretty decent for any other film that's not called Star Wars. But this movie, it would seem, was getting ridiculed from the get just because they had recasted Han and Lando. And everybody was, you know, anxious but excited, I would say, to see Donald Glover, Childish Gambino, be Lando. But everybody was like super hypocritical of Austin Allright being Han Solo from the get. And there's a story that breaks that he's got to do acting lessons, and then there's this and there's that. Movie finally comes out. I actually dug it. I thought it was a fun movie. I thought there's times in that movie where he delivers some of his lines just like Harrison Ford would.
Yeah. It's a tough act to follow. You know, I mean, it's kind of, you know, if it were a standalone film, you wouldn't come in with those expectations. And that's the problem is, you know, the stage has been set for 40 years.
Yeah.
Han Solo is. This guy's got a hell of a lot to live up to. And it's tough, you know. And so the film on its own merits, I think, is really good. But in terms of people's expectations, you know, that's a tough one, you know.
That movie, yeah. That movie too tapped into Clone Wars and even Rebels, kind of, with Darth Maul's character.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say more Clone Wars time period, just because of by Rebels he's kind of out of the syndicate. He's more just Darth Maul trying to corrupt Ezra, but that would be a pretty rad sequel to see some more of that crossover with like Han and Lando and that crime world. You don't even have to do a major character other than Darth Maul that you did. I think it'd be pretty rad.
Well, it's gonna be interesting to see if they develop that further, because I've seen some stuff online. I don't know how reliable that stuff is. That they're going to do some follow-up work for it. So it would be kind of nice to see them revisit that and maybe kind of build that out so it has more of its own legs. So, you know, it would have a you know, more substantial feel to it. Kind of flesh out that version of Han Solo. I think it would be a good thing to do. I'd like to see it. I enjoyed the film, you know.
The other thing too is you coming on board in with the whole Star Wars thing with Episode 3. You've gotten to touch on it in two different eras of the franchise. After Episode 3, I think for the, you know, obvious reason, for the longest time we all thought that was it.
Yes.
Yeah, like we thought, you know, hey, we got to see the origin story, and it was all tied up in a nice package at the end of Return of the Jedi. We had the ghosts waving at Luke, and Luke's waving at the ghosts, and they did it. And I thought that Episode 3 is actually a really good movie.
I like it a lot, you know, and I was on all the prequels, and I also worked on the special editions for Episode 4 and Episode 5. So it was kind of like Star Wars was this thing that was always percolating. There was always some element of Star Wars kind of going all the time. But, you know, we were really surprised when we made the prequels. Because we used to have an annual company meeting, and you could send anonymous questions to George, and he would come down to ILM, and we'd all sit on the main stage, and he'd get a mic and he would read the questions. And somebody would always ask, are we going to make more Star Wars movies? And he'd go, yeah, maybe 5 to 10 years. And that was always the answer. And then one day they announced we were doing them, and it was really a shock. And it was interesting because they were looking for portfolios. And I thought about submitting something, and I didn't do it. I don't know why I didn't do it, but I didn't do it. But I knew Doug Chiang. I'd known Doug Chiang since Back to the Future 2. And Doug called me up and said, hey, can you do a model for me? And it was the first pod racer model. It was the first concept of Anakin's pod, and I built it in about a week. And then the last 24 hours, I was up all night, get this thing done. I take it out to the ranch, I'm like, here, you know. And he's like, you got to stay and meet George. I'm like, I'm going to die. I got to go home and go to bed. I got to stay and meet George. So George came in, and it was really interesting because he looked at the model, and then he talked for about 15 minutes about the pod race. And it was like he went out to Sears Point yesterday and watched it for real. That's the way he was telling us. Like, it was something he saw yesterday, how everything works and what's going on. And I thought, that's amazing. He was really good. He could pick up something. I remember doing a sketch of a little ship. I was back east over Christmas. It was the middle of the night, and I woke up and I made this sketch of this little ship, came back to work. This was on Episode 1, and built a little model of it. He had never seen this thing before. Showed it to him, and for 3 minutes, he talked about how it would work. And I thought, that is incredible. He has never laid eyes on this thing before. But instantly, he has got ideas about how all the technology would work and what it would do. That was really impressive. That used to blow me away with him. He could just do that. It just rolled off the top of his tongue like it was real. Really, really amazing to see that.
Yeah, it's cool that Anakin's pod racer that you got to do. the one thing when you watch the cartoon, the Clone Wars, is his Padawan and best friend throughout it is Ahsoka Tano, and the markings on Anakin's pod racer, I have no idea if they're actually connected, but they're kind of similar to Ahsoka's facial markings. And then they're so closely tied. I thought that was kind of interesting. The last time I watched Phantom Menace.
That sounds like a question for Dave Filoni.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But is there a movie or even a Disney Plus show, man, from that franchise that you, because we know Mandalorian obviously is going to be around for a while, and we know they're doing a Rogue One Diego Luna prequel show, and then they're going to do a Ewan McGregor Obi-Wan show, and then it's all but confirmed they're doing the Ahsoka Tano show. So there's a lot down the line, but is there a movie or show that you would want to see from there?
I'm interested in all of them, to tell you the truth. You know, it's kind of Mandalorian has been a lot of fun to watch, and it's been impressive. This is being delivered on essentially on TV, but it's like film stuff we're seeing. You know, so I've enjoyed the hell out of seeing it. So I'm all for more of the, you know, exploring at the TV universe. They seem to have, it's different from the trilogy. You know, this is a different vibe, different feel. And like I said, they really kind of captured the magic of what, to me, made the original films fun. They are definitely tapping into that. So I'd love to see more of it. So I'm all for any of them they want to do. I think it's great.
The thing too about that is it allows for more, I guess, crossover between digital and practical.
Yeah.
The more that you're able to you know, develop and get into production, if you can do it, you know, that behind the scenes show on Disney Plus after season 1 was done, where they created that vault in the sound stage, and it's like my God, if you wanted to really have that thing going all the time, you could have, you know, every other day you're shooting another show or another episode of the show type of a thing, and it's just like, geez, the amount of possibilities just grow substantially there.
Well, that whole technology, especially given the COVID situation, you know, you can be anywhere you want to. You can go on location, and it's all sitting there on your volume with your theoretically controlled crew. You know, you got your bubble. It's unlimited what you can do with it, pretty much. I mean, there are limitations, but it broadens the horizon so much to have that. And I've been down and seen that in person on the set. It is one hell of an amazing system. So this is probably the future of a lot of production, is this sort of technology. But, you know, Lucasfilm they've got their setup they're using, and that was really something to see. I mean, it was like walking onto another planet, kind of. It was really cool.
I mean, Star Wars is, if you've met us or talked to us at any of the SAC Horror or in Sinister Creature Con, you guys watching this, you know, we're always happy to talk Star Wars. But John has done a whole lot of other movies that are also really cool franchises too. Like you've gotten to do Harry Potter. That is another fan favorite franchise, obviously. How was it working on that movie?
You know, it's funny, when I think about Harry Potter, it was what I called a dirt show. The reason was Congo was a dirt show. Star Trek Generations was a dirt show because there was dirt. Because we were shooting a Quidditch match, and it was really interesting because we built a section of the Quidditch arena in 1/3 scale. So we had to have 1/3 scale dirt. So we'd have to make our own dirt and everything. But we built this corner of the arena, which is an ellipse, and it's lower in the center and higher towards the ends. So we built this one corner that had a higher curve, but we built it so that we could take the top of it off and have a lower version, which is what you'd see in the straightaways. But then we could put the top piece on it, and we had a curve. Then what we had to do is we had a map of all of those fabric banners that were on the towers and on the stands for all the different houses. So we'd have to sit down with the map and figure out where we were, where our piece was going to be on our full track, and figure out what the correct banners were and swap it all out for that. So we'd have to dress this thing repeatedly. And then we were doing the pyro for the that little gold thing. Can't remember what it's called. The little thing, or they're chasing that thing that's blasting through the towers.
Oh, the snitch or whatever?
Yeah, is that it, the snitch?
Yeah.
And it was funny too because we had live grass on that set, so I'd have to go on the weekends and water the set to keep it alive because we had it outdoors, and the whole thing was on wheels. And I remember the first time we had it outside, it was like 30 feet long and like 10 or 12 feet wide. It was pretty damn big, and we were working on it outside, and we were going to move it into the stage. Got a forklift and got behind it, started pushing it. We had all these wheels that Steve Golly had bought on AI for all these work tables. So we had all these beautiful, they were like 4 or 5 inch wheels, casters. So I put these all on the bottom of the set, John Duncan and I had, and start pushing into the stage, and there's a slight concrete ramp there. Those wheels started just exploding. They looked like popcorn. They're just blowing apart. And it was like, we're halfway in the stage. The set starts to break in half. So then we're getting out screw guns and 4-inch zip screws, and we're just plowing them through the thing, trying to make it strong enough it can get over the ramp. By the time we got it inside, the set's broken in half. The wheels were all broken off of it. We had to buy steel wheels to put on the thing, and then it went outside. It never came back in again. But that may have been the only Harry Potter film I worked on, was that one. There were some other mock-ups we made for some stage shoot stuff, little things, but you know, that was the primary, was that Quidditch field, which was that was an interesting set to build. Like I said, figuring out what their shots were going to be, where you were going to be, and then to dress the thing correctly and get it all right. You're having to look at this thing. It reminds me of Star Trek VI, because on Star Trek VI, the Enterprise they go into battle, and the Enterprise winds up with 11 hits on it. Well, we had a map on the stage of the Enterprise, and it had each hit and what number it was. And then we had Polaroids. They were like makeup continuity Polaroids of each one of the hits. And the reason we had all that was because tomorrow we're going to shoot, and it's got hits 1 through 7. But the day after that, it's only got hits 1 through 3. And then that afternoon, it's got to have all 11 back on it. But then the next day, we're going back to 5. Because things, like they always are on movies, they're not shot in sequence. So we were constantly having to put the damage on, remove the damage, you know, depending on how many shots it had, how many times it had been hit at that point in the sequence. So that kind of stuff, trying to keep up with it, it's kind of complicated. And we actually wore through the paint on top of the saucer. It's funny because Jeff Bezos has that model in the lobby of his rocket company. And we actually wore the paint away where the biggest hit was on top of the saucer, because we had it on and off so many times we actually looked at the paint. But yeah. But yeah.
Is that what you guys were using? Were you painting the damage on and then painting over the damage, or what were you guys doing?
Well, it was, some of it was rubber cement, and then it was some aluminum tape, and it was, we were trying to make these little, they were almost like appliques that you could put on it, but you actually had to adhere it and stuff so that it didn't move, and it had to look the same. So, you know, every time you do this, you're trying to be really careful. But if you take this thing on and off 15, 20 times, you know, it does wear away at what's underneath it. So it's hanger rash, or, you know, it's from mileage.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sometimes it's funny when a model comes on stage and it's all pristine and everybody has worked so hard on it, and by the time the shoot's over, it's been set on fire, it's been sawed in half, there's a big hole in it where they had to put something, you know, they just get trashed. And when you see what finally went up on film, you're like, we could have painted a grocery bag and brought it out here for the level of damage it's suffered and how screwed up it gets. But, you know, it looks okay on camera. So
for sure.
Well, that was something else that I remember when I first started in the shop. They said, how do you feel about blowing stuff up? I'm like, what are you talking about? You know, destroy your stuff. I'm like, you know, that was an adjustment, because they said, what we should do with everybody that comes in the shop, have them build something they absolutely love, trick it out, get it absolutely perfect. And when it's just the way they want it, they have to put it on the floor and jump up and down and smash it to pieces. Dang. Because that's part of the job, is you build the stuff, they take it on stage and they just blow it to bits, you know? So to me, they became science experiments, because it was always a test. You know, what could you do? I remember using this lead wire that was for fishing, it was for weights. But I remember on Temple of the Crystal Skull, we built these cars, and I wanted the wheels, because we had this Doomtown thing where a nuclear blast goes off. And I wanted these cars to get torn up, but I didn't want them to just come to pieces. So the wheels were held on with this 1/4-inch lead wire that was glued into the bottom of the car and really glued into the wheels, so they could bend and twist and stuff, but they wouldn't separate. And then the hood and the doors and all that stuff were held on with cable ties, so they could come open, but they'd stay on the car. So you get some nice movement out of it. And what inspired that was a shot in Terminator 2. They show the nuclear detonation in Los Angeles, and you see this car go by, and the hood and the doors are open and stuff. And I thought that really sells that shot. So that was kind of an inspiration for pulling that into Indiana Jones. But pyro stuff was always, or on Terminator 4, we built a hunter killer, one of the flying hunter killer engines, and it was about 3.5 feet tall. And I had to make the turbine blade that went in the top of the engine. I was like, what am I going to make this thing out of? And pasta is always good for pyro, because if you hit it with a charge, the shock will just shatter the pasta. So I went out and got lasagna noodles, and I made a template. And I could get a flat turbine blade out of one piece of lasagna noodle. So I made about 60 of those and put them in a circle, glued them all together, and then took a plastic wine glass, sanded the neck off of that, and vacuum formed a 10,000th piece of plastic over it. So it's super thin. Glued that in the middle of my pasta fan blades, painted the whole thing black, took a chip brush with some silver rub and buff, and did a dry brush thing on it, and it gives it all these metal highlights. It looks just like a real fan blade. We blew that thing up. I couldn't even find a fragment of it. It just vaporized, And we were doing a shoot not too long ago. We were recreating blowing up Jabba's barge on the Star Wars show, and packed that thing with about 10 different kinds of pasta. It's cheap. You paint it black, and you get all kinds of neat shapes when something explodes. So.
Dang, that's a very cool tip. Just so pasta for if you're going to work on anything miniature. That's good to know. That's cool.
Yeah. Doesn't work well.
You mentioned you're working on the film earlier, Back to the Future 2. Yeah. That movie, I can remember being a kid watching that movie in the theater. It's like one of the first ones I saw in the movie theater. And I can remember feeling like, man, that is the future. Like that's so cool. Like that, because the first one's the 50s, the third one's the Old West. Those are both things that you can visually tie actual factual stuff to, but the take on the future in that franchise is so fantastical to get to have done work on. How was that film?
That was really cool, because that was one of the first films. I'd worked on Ghostbusters 2. I started off on Body Wars in Ghostbusters 2, and I think Back to the Future 2 was the next thing I worked on. And Steve Golly had me helping him with, we were doing concept models early on for the future police car, and there was one of them was a drink bottle and different versions of what the almanac could have been, digital versions of it, because at one point it wasn't going to be a book. It was going to be a variety of different things. So we built models of all those, and there was a beautiful, I did one police car, and then Steve did one that was really cool. Very different from what wound up in the film. But they were just kind of starting points, But
Can you share what the almanac almost was?
They were like digital versions of it. One of them had a screen, it was weird. It had like what looked like a little CO2 tank put into a like an airsoft gun.
Yeah.
It had that on the side, and it had kind of a center part with a control console, and then it had a screen at the top of it. One of them looked like some kind of a sports radio. It was yellow. It was about that big and rectangular, and it actually had a CD that stuck into the end of it. So the CD would have spun on the end, and there was a screen on that. And there was another one. I don't remember what that one was, but there were just different versions of it electronically. I think the book ultimately was a much better solution.
Yeah.
It's, and it's cleaner, I think. But it was interesting. I mean, that's part of the filmmaking process, or any story process, is that development and the evolution of the ideas. And it's always interesting to see what it could have been, not just what it is, but there are all these other iterations. That's why I love the art of books for every film, because you see all these different versions of what it could have been. Well, when you start thinking about casting, it's like, what would this movie have been like if that was Marlon Brando playing that part? Or, you get so used to somebody being that person, it's hard to separate them. But you realize if someone else had been cast back then, like Harrison Ford, you'd have a different idea of who Han Solo was. It would have been a different guy, But that's part of the love of these films, too, is that those characters are ones that you latch onto, and you really love that, and you want to see more of it. And that's the fun of this whole thing. Is you're so into it, you want more all the time. That's when all the gears are clicking in the right places.
The thing about doing practical effects with any movie, whether it be science fiction, horror, action, what have you, is it feels very personal. Like it feels close to the viewer. Like when you see a practical ship on Star Wars or Star Trek, versus digital, it's almost, at least to me, like a sense of you're in that world specifically, right? And when you're watching a digital film, it's like you're watching this really rad painting play itself out in front of you.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, because I think practical tends to be more visceral. I think it's easier to connect with it because you can directly relate to it. Digital, it's really fascinating because, you know, you think about some of the films that were made in the 80s, 70s, 80s with the effects technology at the time, and it's funny because there was a poster that Scott Ross, he was the general manager at ILM, on the 15th anniversary of ILM, he gave out this poster. It was every film that ILM had worked on. And when you looked at, you know, there's 1975, it was like Star Wars, you know, and then 1978, it was, you know, Empire. And then it was like, you know, 3 or 4 years later, it was 2 films happened that year. And then it was maybe 2 films the next year, maybe 3 films. But there weren't that many visual effects films. And so you think about the limitations of storytelling with practical, and it's amazing what can be done. You can innovate and do all kinds of really interesting things. Digital opened up this whole other, it's like Dorothy walking into Oz when it's color. It opened up this whole other world of possibility. There are things you can do there that would be pretty much impossible practically. I think the best approach is when you combine practical and digital together. I think it's the most interesting because I always say it's like a bouquet of flowers. If, you know, you got a daisy full of, or a, you know, vase full of daisies, it doesn't look like much. If you've got a whole bouquet of things, and that's practical, digital, if you use every trick in the book, I think that gives you a more satisfying result. Yeah. So, but it is really interesting. I mean, you know, the physical models, and then there are things that are done digitally that I think execute as well as practical stuff. But, you know, it's all over the place, you know, but there are a lot of times when I'm looking at digital stuff, I'm like, oh, that's digital. And I'm not pulled into that world like that. That there is some kind of a distance between me and that thing. Whereas with a model, I have much less of that. I'm much more willing to accept it. But that, you know, that's a personal bias. I've been fascinated with models for 50 years, you know, so I'm definitely all on that side of things.
Is there a piece that you've made, or like, have you gotten to keep like any cool souvenir from any of the stuff that you've built?
I don't know if you can see in the background, there's all kinds of crap in here. There's stuff everywhere.
Oh, right on.
Yeah, there's stuff. Our entire house, we've got stuff everywhere. There's stuff everywhere. So, you know, and some of it's from films, but then a lot of it's just stuff I build because I've never stopped building stuff, you know. So it's constantly, I may be working on somebody else's stuff, but I've usually got 1 or 2 of my own projects going too. So it's kind of, you know, there's no end of models and things laying around the house. Sometimes I wish there were less. There are a couple times I thought, you know, if the place burned down, it'd be kind of a blessing. Just walk away, get the cat, leave.
Is there a world, you know, genre that you, when you're just kind of like figuring stuff out to build just for the sake of building it, that you like building? Is it science fiction or Western or any?
Typically science fiction. Typically science fiction. It's funny because I'm building a couple things right now from Star Trek: The Motion Picture that are just me messing around. One of them is the Vulcan shuttle, and one of them is the worker bee that you see flying around the space dock.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, these are just things that I just want to do it for myself. So I'm building them, you know, in their studio scale. They're right in line with the original models, but and they're as close as I can get them. They're not going to be exact. You put them side by side. The thing I always say is, you know what? You could take it and shoot it, and if you can tell the difference, let me know. Because I've got one that's sitting. I always get confused with which direction the camera's going. There's this behind me.
Oh yeah.
Well, that's the ship from Alien, and that's one I scratch built just for fun.
Wow.
And it started off, I got this little Konami toy that was like 3 inches long, and it was so beautiful. And so I found Martin Bauer's images of the model on you know, that he built. And then, you know, from that built this. The thing was, I didn't track down every single model part that was, you know, this exactly the same kit. And at that point in time, I was like, I'm not going to spend my time doing that. I was like, if there's a round thing, I got a round thing. Square thing, I got a square thing. If I take it out on stage and shoot it, you won't know the difference. Because it's between Alien and Aliens, the drop ship changed because the model disappeared at the end of Alien. And so the one that appears in Aliens is very different. And if you look at them side by side, they're proportionally different. The details are different. Everything's different. People don't pick up on that, you know. So Now, for some things, I will go and try and research and find the original kit parts. For the Star Trek stuff I'm doing, I pretty much tracked down all the original kit parts. But that's been an evolution of my process. I didn't used to think that was important. Now I'm like, yeah, if I can do it, yes, I'll do it. So, and I've been working on a project for one company it's an old model. It's 50 years old. And it's been really interesting. It's for the Academy. It's the Ares from 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's a restoration of that model, which is the only surviving model from that film. And no one thought anything existed. And this thing turned up about 4 years ago at auction, and it had been stored in an outdoor potting shed. And it had, 40 plus years of sitting in a potting shed, exposed to the weather. It had house paint on it, had crayon on it. Kids had played with it. Parts were broken off and glued back in the wrong places, and a lot of stuff was missing. So that one has been a huge amount of research, finding all the original parts, tracking down 50-year-old model kits and trying to figure out what this piece is, So that's been an interesting puzzle to solve. And we're about 95% complete with that. But that's been a 4-year project. So.
Who's your favorite Star Wars character?
Wow, no one's ever asked. That's a tough question. I think I'd have to go between Han Solo and Darth Vader.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. I never thought about it.
The different worlds that you've gone to do too. Do you ever, having gone and done those films, do you ever get to do any real world stuff, like gone to Galaxy's Edge and went in the Disney parks and kind of seen they've taken it's your guys' artistic style as a film crew, and now they've transplanted it into an actual physical place? Do you ever go to that kind of stuff and check it out?
Yeah, I went to Galaxy's Edge, and Doug Chang worked on that. A huge project for him. And I've worked with Doug a lot over the years, and so it's all the same people in the art department that are working on the films and the TV shows are the ones working on Galaxy's Edge too. And so it was pretty cool to be able to go and see that stuff in kind of more of a real world, like a full 360 environment where you could walk around. And one of the things I appreciated almost more than anything was the sound they had, because they have a sound system. It sounds like spaceships are taking off and flying overhead.
Mm-hmm.
That was impressive, because it was kind of magic, because you're not seeing it. It's kind of stagecraft. It's like the implications are all there. You just can't see it. So you're imagining, and again, you're your own best art director. What was that? Then a news helicopter flies over, kind of breaks the illusion. But it was really impressive to go around and see all that stuff, and to see the Falcon full size. That was really impressive. It's funny though, because I was a little disappointed, because when the Falcon, all those models, when they're built, the big Falcon that was built for Star Wars was about 5 feet long. Those are kit parts glued onto it. And when they extrapolate that up to full size, where it's 80 feet long or whatever it is, sometimes it looks like kit parts stuck on it. It doesn't look functional enough. And that was my one thing with the Falcon. I'm walking around the back of it, and I'm looking at it, and I'm like, it wouldn't take much to make it look like all those cylinders actually work, these things that lift these flaps and stuff. You could make this all look very functional. It would just be taking it one more step. So that's my only disappointment, is that translation from a 5-foot miniature up to full size. It's like, oh, well, it doesn't quite sell as real to me. But I'm looking at it through from a pretty biased perspective. I'm like, if we had to make it, how would we do it for film? You'd add more detail and do things to it. But still, it's really cool to see it realized in the real world. You can walk around in it.
For sure.
The only other experience I had like that was Star Trek: The Next Generation. Was going down to visit those guys. And that was amazing, because you walked into the Enterprise. We went into the Enterprise through a turbo lift, through the side of it. Had a door on it. You open it up. We had to go in and pull the doors open, and they were recarpeting. It was between seasons. But once you're in there, you're in there. That corridor leads to the transporter room. The sick bay is off to the right. It's like you're in that ship. And we went all through it, and it was on 2 stages. But the only way off the one set was you walked out through the view screen of the bridge. It was at floor level. But that was amazing, because you walked around, and it was really cool, because like in the transporter room, there were panels on the wall, and you could open them. They were magnetic. You could pull it off, and it was all percolating inside with all these electronics and stuff. They weren't even shooting. And you pull the panel off, you're like, wow, it's all doing its thing in there. It looked real. It was really cool. So again, it was kind of that seeing it in 360. It's a real environment. So a lot of times on films, you go on set and you're like, oh, you walk around the back of the plywood and you're like, oh, okay. It's kind of disappointing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, man, is there any way for people to kind of like keep tabs and see what you're going to be working on next?
The only thing that I have is my IMDb page, which I'm not really good about updating. I think the last one was Mandalorian, and so much what I do now, I'm doing work. I've done work for them for the TV show. A lot of the work I'm doing now is restoration and just client work on the outside. So I'm working for a number of museums and things like that. There's not, there hasn't been much call yet for any kind of film or other than the Mandalorian stuff. I'm just doing all this work, just building stuff for museums primarily. So it's not as interesting as movie stuff.
Well, we will await your reapproach into one of what I will be sure is a super fun watch whenever we finally get to find out what the next one you work on is. But John, man, thank you for taking the time out to talk to us today.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun.